Say that again, the Billionaire CEO said, at her assistant's door 5 minutes after the flirty text. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's emotional story about two women whose lives are forever changed by one impulsive text, one unexpected knock at the door, and a love that neither of them ever saw coming, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell, so you never miss a new story from our channel. It is quick, it is free, and it helps us continue bringing you more heartfelt, dramatic and unforgettable stories about courage, healing, second chances, and love between women. Your support truly means the world to us. And tell me, where are you watching from today? Share your city or country in the comments below. Thank you so much. Now, let us return to our main character and the 5 unforgettable minutes that quietly changed the course of her life forever. One careless message can reveal the truth your heart has been hiding for years. I had worked for Claire Whitmore for 3 years, 4 months, and 12 days, but who was counting? Everyone at Whitmore Global knew her as the billionaire CEO who could walk into a boardroom, ask a single question, and leave executives scrambling for answers before she even sat down. Financial magazines called her brilliant. Business reporters called her unstoppable. Employees called her intimidating, though never within earshot. I simply called her Ms. Whitmore, because that was the safest choice. Every morning began the same way. Black coffee waiting on her desk at exactly 7:15 a.m. The day's meetings color-coded by priority. Contracts reviewed twice. Flight schedules confirmed. Every detail in perfect order before she arrived. She never demanded perfection, but somehow everyone around her wanted to achieve it anyway. That was her gift. She inspired excellence without raising her voice. At least that was what everyone believed. What they never saw were the moments when she stayed behind after everyone else had gone home, staring through the glass walls of her office toward the Chicago skyline as if success had built her a castle with no one inside it. Sometimes I wondered what loneliness looked like on someone who had everything. I never expected to learn the answer. That Thursday had already stretched into a 14-hour workday. Investors have flown in from New York, legal teams were revising acquisition documents, and every phone in the executive suite seemed determined to ring at the same time. By the time I finally reached my apartment a little after 9 p.m., I kicked off my shoes, collapsed onto the couch, and laughed at how exhausted I felt. My best friend Mia texted almost immediately. "Still alive," she wrote. I smiled for the first time all day. We joked constantly, especially after impossible workdays. Without thinking, I typed, "If Claire Whitmore ever looked at me the way she looks at quarterly reports, I might actually forget how tired I am." I hit send. Then my stomach dropped. The message had not gone to Mia. It had gone to Claire Whitmore. My hands froze around my phone as every terrible possibility rushed into my mind. Fired tomorrow. Security escorting me out. Human resources scheduling an uncomfortable meeting. 3 tiny dots appeared on my screen, then disappeared. No reply. Maybe she had not read it. Maybe there was still hope. I paced across my apartment, trying to convince myself that technology occasionally performed miracles. 5 endless minutes crawled by. Then someone knocked on my front door. My heartbeat became impossibly loud in the silence. Nobody visited me unannounced. I glanced through the peephole and nearly forgot how to breathe. Standing beneath the warm hallway light, still wearing the charcoal business suit she had worn to the final board meeting, was Claire Whitmore. One hand rested casually inside her coat pocket while the other held her phone. She looked neither angry nor amused. She simply waited. I opened the door before my courage disappeared completely. Her blue eyes met mine with a calmness I had never seen inside the office. She lifted her phone just enough for me to recognize the message glowing on the screen, offered the smallest hint of a smile, and quietly said, "Say that again." For a long moment neither of us spoke. I stood barefoot in the doorway of my tiny apartment, wondering whether I should apologize, explain myself, or simply disappear into the floor. Claire Whitmore remained perfectly still, her phone lowered at her side now, her expression impossible to read. She looked different outside the office. The polished confidence was still there, but without the conference room lights and the endless stream of executives surrounding her, she seemed almost human. The silence stretched until I finally managed to whisper, "I am so sorry. That message was never meant for you." She tilted her head slightly. I know. That answer surprised me more than anything else could have. You know. She nodded once. You addressed someone else in the previous message. Heat rushed into my face. Of course she had seen the conversation. There was no escaping the embarrassment now. I understand if you want to terminate my employment, I said quietly. It was careless. Completely unprofessional. Instead of responding immediately, she glanced past me into my apartment. It was small, clean, filled with secondhand furniture and shelves crowded with paperback novels. A faded photograph of my mother rested beside a tiny plant on the windowsill. May I come in for 5 minutes? She asked. That was the last question I expected from the most powerful woman in the company. I stepped aside almost automatically. She entered with the same calm presence she carried into every board meeting. Yet somehow the room felt less intimidating than it did every time I walked into her office. She noticed the framed community college diploma hanging beside the kitchen. Business administration, she said softly. You graduated while working full-time. I blinked. You remember that? I try to know the people who make my company better every day. That sentence settled somewhere deep inside me. For 3 years I had assumed I was invisible. Just another assistant scheduling meetings and solving problems before anyone noticed they existed. She remembered details I had forgotten mentioning. Claire accepted the glass of water I offered but barely touched it. Do you know why I came instead of sending an email? She asked. I shook my head. Because emails are terrible at telling the truth. She looked toward the dark window overlooking the city street. People are honest for exactly 1 second before they convince themselves to edit their feelings. I swallowed carefully. It was only a joke. Was it? She asked gently, not accusingly. I searched for an answer that sounded safe, professional, forgettable. None of them felt honest. It was admiration, I admitted. You built something extraordinary. You treat people fairly. You remember birthdays. You know the receptionist's grandson just started kindergarten. You send handwritten notes after difficult projects. Everyone thinks they work for a billionaire. Most days I think I work for someone who still notices people. Claire looked down at the untouched glass in her hands. A quiet smile appeared and disappeared almost instantly. Nobody has ever described me that way. There was something fragile hidden beneath those words. Something completely different from the fearless executive the world admired. For the first time since she knocked on my door, I realized she had not come because of one accidental text. She had come because somewhere beneath the headlines, the awards, and the billions of dollars, there was a woman who desperately needed to know whether someone had truly seen her beyond the title. Claire remained quietly seated at my small kitchen table, her fingers resting around the untouched glass of water, as though she had forgotten why she picked it up in the first place. Outside, the steady glow of Chicago's streetlights reflected against the windows, turning the apartment into a world that felt strangely removed from everything waiting for us downtown. I had spent years believing that confidence came naturally to her, that wealth erased uncertainty and success eliminated loneliness. Sitting across from her now, I realized how completely wrong I had been. She looked around my apartment again, her attention settling on the worn cookbook beside the coffee maker. Your mother's, she asked. I smiled softly. She taught me that every meal is a chance to remind someone they matter. Claire nodded almost absent-mindedly. My family believed every dinner was another business negotiation. Her voice carried no bitterness, only quiet acceptance. When I was 10 years old, my father told me that emotions belonged at home and business belonged everywhere else. The problem was that home eventually became another boardroom. I listened without interrupting. For the first time since I had met her, Claire Whitmore was not choosing every word to impress investors or persuade directors. She was simply remembering. When I became chief executive officer, she continued, everyone congratulated me for winning. The strange thing about reaching the top is discovering how few people ask whether you are happy once you get there. Her eyes drifted toward the family photograph on my shelf. Your mother looks proud. I laughed quietly. She was proud when I earned my first paycheck, not because of the amount, but because she said honest work lets you sleep peacefully. Claire repeated those words almost to herself. Honest work lets you sleep peacefully. A thoughtful silence settled between us. I realized that this woman, whose calendar was planned months in advance, had chosen to spend her evening in the apartment of an assistant because one accidental message had broken through years of carefully constructed distance. "Can I ask you something?" I said carefully. She met my eyes. "Of course. Why did my message matter so much?" She took a slow breath before answering. "Because it sounded genuine." She gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. "People compliment my company, my decisions, my investments, even my clothes. Very few people ever say anything about me." I felt my heart tighten. "You have thousands of employees." "I know." She smiled gently. "And somehow success can still be incredibly quiet." The room felt warmer than it had only minutes earlier. We spoke about ordinary things after that. My community college classes. Her first apartment before the company became successful. The terrible coffee she drank during her first startup years because it was all she could afford. We laughed when she admitted she once assembled office furniture backward and blamed the instructions instead of herself. It was impossible to imagine the woman featured on magazine covers struggling with an instruction manual. Yet somehow that story made her feel more real than every headline I had ever read. Time slipped by unnoticed until Claire glanced at her watch and sighed. "I have an investor breakfast at 7. I looked at the clock on my microwave. It was almost 11. She stood, smoothing the sleeve of her charcoal jacket, but neither of us moved toward the door immediately. Something invisible had shifted between us, not into romance, not yet, but into trust. Before leaving, Claire looked back at me with a softness I had never seen inside the office. "Thank you for seeing the person before the title, Sophie." As the door closed behind her, I leaned against it, my heart still racing, because I suddenly understood that the most unexpected conversations are often the ones that quietly change everything before either person realizes a new chapter has already begun. The next morning, I arrived at Whitmore Global 20 minutes earlier than usual, hoping that routine would quiet the questions racing through my mind. The lobby looked exactly as it always did: polished marble floors, fresh white orchids, and the familiar hum of elevators carrying ambitious people toward another demanding day. Everything appeared unchanged, yet nothing felt the same. Every time I glanced toward the executive floor, I remembered Claire sitting at my kitchen table, talking about sleepless nights instead of stock prices. I reminded myself that whatever had happened the evening before stayed outside these office walls. At 7:15 sharp, I placed her coffee on the corner of her desk and organized the morning briefing exactly as I always had. When Claire entered the office a few minutes later, she greeted me with the same composed professionalism she showed every workday. "Good morning, Sophie." "Good morning, Ms. Whitmore." Our exchange lasted only seconds, but I noticed something different. Her voice carried a quiet warmth that had not been there before, subtle enough that nobody else would recognize it, yet impossible for me to miss. The morning quickly disappeared beneath meetings, conference calls, and contract reviews. Around noon, I accompanied Claire to a strategy session with senior executives. As I handed out presentation folders, I caught fragments of conversations that immediately tightened the knot in my stomach. The board is watching every move. Public perception matters more than ever. Investors do not tolerate unnecessary distractions. Those words were not directed at me, yet they lingered in the room long after the meeting ended. Success, I realized, came with invisible walls that surrounded people long before they noticed they were trapped inside them. Later that afternoon, while organizing travel arrangements, I overheard two managers chatting outside my desk. "Have you noticed the chief executive officer has been staying later recently?" one asked. "She practically lives here," the other replied. "That is the price of running a company worth billions." They laughed politely before walking away. I looked through the glass wall into Claire's office. She was standing alone, reading financial reports, the Chicago skyline stretching behind her. Everyone admired her position. Very few wondered what it had cost her to reach it. Around 5 o'clock, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Do not forget to eat dinner tonight. Success is easier to enjoy when you are healthy." I smiled at the familiar reminder. My mother had always believed that caring for people began with the smallest gestures. Without thinking, I walked to the cafe downstairs and picked up 2 containers of homemade vegetable soup, remembering Claire had admitted the previous evening that she often skipped dinner during difficult weeks. I hesitated outside her office door for almost a full minute before knocking. "Come in," she called. She looked up from a stack of reports, surprise briefly replacing her usual calm expression when she saw the paper bag in my hands. "I know this is probably crossing a professional line," I said carefully, "but my mother would never forgive me if I let someone work 14 hours without eating." For a heartbeat she simply stared at the bag. Then a soft laugh escaped her, genuine and completely unguarded. "Your mother sounds wiser than most consultants I have hired." She accepted the soup with both hands as though it were something unexpectedly valuable. "Thank you, Sophie." At that exact moment, the office door opened without warning. One of the company's board members stepped inside, paused after seeing the two of us together, glanced at the soup between us, and although he smiled politely, the brief look in his eyes told me he had already begun drawing conclusions that neither of us had intended to create. The atmosphere inside Whitmore Global shifted so gradually that anyone walking through the building might have missed it, but I felt every subtle change. Conversation stopped a little sooner when I approached. Smiles became more careful. A few people who usually chatted with me during lunch suddenly remembered meetings they had to attend. Nothing had been said directly, yet silence often carries messages louder than words. I told myself I was imagining it until Friday morning, when I entered the executive conference room to prepare for the quarterly leadership briefing. Two board members were already inside, their voices low enough that they clearly believed no one else could hear them. "Claire has always been disciplined," one said. "I just hope she remembers that perception can move markets faster than performance." The other sighed. "Investors are already asking questions about her recent decisions. We cannot afford unnecessary speculation." I quietly placed the presentation folders on the table without interrupting them. Neither man mentioned my name, but something inside me knew exactly where those concerns were pointing. Throughout the meeting, Claire remained composed, answering every financial question with the confidence that had built one of the country's most respected companies. Watching her command the room, nobody would have guessed that she had shared homemade soup with her assistant less than 24 hours earlier. She never glanced in my direction longer than necessary. Every instruction was formal. Every conversation stayed strictly professional. By the end of the afternoon I understood why. She was protecting both of us. That realization should have comforted me. Instead, it left an unexpected ache I struggled to explain. Late that evening, after most employees had gone home, I stayed behind to finish organizing documents for an upcoming investor tour. As I sorted travel schedules, I noticed a leather notebook resting on the corner of the conference table. It belonged to Claire. I recognized the embossed initials immediately. Without opening it, I carried it to her office and knocked gently. "Come in," she called. She was still working, reading through a stack of sustainability reports with the same focused expression she wore during every major decision. "You left this in the conference room," I said, placing the notebook on her desk. Relief crossed her face for just a moment. "Thank you. I have been looking for it." I started to leave, but she quietly added, "Sophie." I turned back. She hesitated before speaking, choosing her words with unusual care. "If I seem distant today, it is not because of anything you have done." I offered a small smile. "I know." She looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. Sometimes leadership means disappointing yourself before anyone else has the chance to do it. Those words stayed with me long after I returned to my desk. As I gathered my bag to leave for the night, I made a decision that felt both painful and necessary. If rumors continued to grow, Claire's reputation, the company she had spent decades building, and the livelihoods of thousands of employees could all be affected by something as simple as misplaced assumptions. I cared about her too much to become the reason that happened. Walking out into the cool Chicago evening, I quietly resolved that beginning Monday, I would ask human resources to transfer me to another executive team, even if it meant walking away from the one person who had finally made me believe that being truly seen was possible. Monday morning arrived with the crisp chill of early autumn drifting through downtown Chicago, but the weight inside my chest felt far heavier than the cool air outside. I reached the office before sunrise, carrying a sealed envelope that had taken me the entire weekend to write. It was not a resignation letter. It was a formal request to transfer to another executive division. I had rewritten it 6 times, removing every sentence that sounded emotional until only practical reasons remained. New professional opportunities, broader administrative experience, departmental flexibility. Every word was technically true, yet none of them contained the real reason. I simply wanted to protect Claire from becoming the subject of rumors she did not deserve. I left the envelope on the Human Resources Director's desk before anyone else arrived, and returned to the executive floor pretending that nothing had changed. At 8 o'clock, Claire walked out of the elevator with the same calm confidence she carried every morning. She greeted employees by name, thanked the maintenance team for repairing a lighting issue over the weekend, and complimented the receptionist on the photographs of her grandson's first soccer game. Watching her notice people so naturally reminded me why that accidental text had existed in the first place. Kindness was not something she performed for cameras. It was simply who she was when nobody expected anything from her. By mid-morning, I had convinced myself that the transfer request would quietly move through the system without attracting attention. That illusion disappeared just after lunch when Human Resources called me upstairs. The director looked unusually uncomfortable as she folded her hands across the desk. "Your request cannot be processed yet," she explained. "Any reassignment involving the executive office requires final approval from the chief executive officer." My heart sank. Of course it did. I thanked her politely and walked back downstairs feeling as though every step had become heavier than the last. Less than 10 minutes later my desk phone rang. "Ms. Reynolds," Claire's familiar voice said evenly. "Could you come to my office when you have a moment?" Her tone revealed nothing. I carried my notebook inside, expecting to discuss travel schedules or investor meetings. Instead, my transfer request rested neatly in the center of her desk. Claire did not immediately speak. She simply looked at the envelope for several quiet seconds before lifting her eyes to meet mine. "Were you planning to tell me?" she asked softly. I lowered my gaze. "I thought it would make things easier." "For whom?" she asked. I searched for the safest answer. "For the company." Claire slowly stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "Do you know what the hardest part of leadership is?" she asked without turning around. "Everyone assumes every decision you make is motivated by strategy." She finally faced me again. "Sometimes it is motivated by fear." I blinked in surprise. "Fear?" She nodded. "Fear that one misunderstanding will erase years of trust. Fear that people will judge intentions they never bother to ask about. Fear that good people will sacrifice themselves to protect everyone except themselves." Her words settled heavily between us. Before I could respond, there was another knock at her office door. The chairman of the board stepped inside with two directors following close behind. Their expressions were serious but composed. "Claire," the chairman said, "we need to discuss several concerns that have reached the board this morning." Claire glanced toward me for only an instant before calmly answering, "Then let us discuss them together, because I have no intention of allowing assumptions to speak louder than the truth." The boardroom fell unusually quiet after the chairman finished outlining the concerns that had reached the directors. Nobody accused anyone directly, yet every carefully chosen sentence pointed toward the same uncomfortable conclusion. Perception, optics, professional boundaries. Words that sounded reasonable on paper somehow felt painfully detached from the people they described. I remained near the conference table, wishing I could disappear without making the situation more difficult for Claire. She stood at the head of the room with remarkable composure, listening without interrupting until every director had finished speaking. Only then did she fold her hands calmly in front of her. "I appreciate every concern that has been raised," she began. "Protecting this company has been my responsibility for many years, and I take that responsibility seriously." Her voice remained steady, neither defensive nor cold. "However, protecting this company also means protecting the integrity of the people who work here. Rumors should never replace facts." One director adjusted his glasses before asking, "Then perhaps you could clarify the nature of your relationship with Ms. Reynolds." My pulse quickened. Every instinct told me to speak first, to accept responsibility, to make this easier for her. Before I could open my mouth, Claire gently lifted one hand, asking for a moment. "Ms. Reynolds has conducted herself with professionalism every single day she has worked for this company," Claire replied. "Any suggestion otherwise is unsupported." Another board member leaned forward. Then why did she request a transfer this morning? The room became completely still. I lowered my eyes. Claire glanced briefly toward me before answering with complete honesty. Because she was trying to protect this organization. Those words surprised everyone, including me. She believed distancing herself would prevent unnecessary speculation. That decision reflects character, not misconduct. The chairman remained thoughtful. And do you support the transfer? Claire took a slow breath before responding. No, every face around the table turned toward her. I do not support talented employees sacrificing their careers because others choose assumptions over conversations. She paused just long enough for the silence to settle. If we encourage that behavior, we reward gossip instead of integrity. Something changed inside the room. The discussion shifted away from whispered rumors and toward company culture, leadership, and accountability. By the end of the meeting, the board requested a review of internal communication policies, rather than disciplinary action against anyone. As the directors gradually left the conference room, relief mixed with exhaustion washed over me. I remained behind, quietly collecting notebooks and presentation folders while Claire stood beside the window overlooking the city. Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I turned toward her. You should have approved my transfer, I whispered. It would have been simpler. She smiled gently, though there was sadness in her eyes. Simple is not always right. I shook my head. I never wanted to become a complication in your life. Claire looked at me with the same calm sincerity I had first seen outside my apartment door. Sophie, caring about another person is never the complication. Forgetting our values because we are afraid of what others might think, that is the real danger. I felt emotion rise unexpectedly in my chest. She stepped no closer than professional courtesy allowed, respecting every boundary that mattered. Yet her words reached me more deeply than any gesture could have. Whatever happens next, she said quietly, I will never ask you to give up your future for mine. If the path that brings you happiness leads somewhere beyond this office, I will respect it completely. People are not meant to be held back by titles, including mine. At that moment I understood that the strongest leaders are not the ones who control every outcome, but the ones who care enough to let others choose their own. The weeks that followed transformed Whitmore Global in ways no quarterly report could ever measure. Instead of pretending the difficult conversations had never happened, Claire chose to face them with the same determination that had built her company from a rented office into an international corporation. She invited employees from every department to participate in a series of listening sessions, not because public relations demanded it, but because she believed trust could only grow where people felt safe enough to speak honestly. For the first time since I had joined the company, executives, assistants, interns, and managers sat together without titles defining who deserved to be heard first. I watched Claire spend hours taking handwritten notes instead of delivering speeches. She asked questions more often than she offered answers. What makes you feel respected at work? Became the conversation that echoed through every conference room. The responses were surprisingly simple. People wanted transparency, fair opportunities, honest communication, leaders who admitted mistakes, co-workers who looked beyond job titles. Listening to those conversations, I realized that every meaningful change begins with someone willing to stop talking long enough to hear another person's story. A month later, Claire introduced a new company initiative focused on professional mentorship, ethical leadership, and employee well-being. The program created confidential support resources, clearer promotion standards, expanded leadership training, and regular forums where anyone could raise concerns without fear of being ignored. To my complete surprise, she asked me to help design the communication framework. You understand how people experience this company every day, she explained during one planning meeting. Policies matter, but people remember how they are treated. Working beside her felt different now. We remained completely professional inside the office, yet the quiet trust between us continued to grow. We challenged each other's ideas, celebrated small victories, and occasionally shared lunch in the company cafeteria instead of hiding behind executive schedules. Those ordinary moments became far more meaningful than dramatic gestures ever could have been. One afternoon, while reviewing feedback from employees, I noticed a handwritten comment left anonymously. This is the first place where I feel like my voice matters. I quietly slid the note across the conference table toward Claire. She read it twice before smiling with unmistakable gratitude. "That," she said softly, "is worth more than any business award I have ever received." I understood exactly what she meant. Success measured in profits could build impressive buildings, but success measured in human dignity could change lives long after financial headlines faded away. As winter slowly gave way to spring, the atmosphere throughout the company became noticeably lighter. People laughed more freely in the hallways. Departments collaborated instead of competing. Managers began scheduling regular check-ins focused not only on performance but also on personal growth. Even the board members who had once worried about appearances acknowledged that employee satisfaction and retention had reached their highest levels in years. One evening after another, long planning session, Claire and I stood beside the office windows watching the sun disappear behind the Chicago skyline. Neither of us spoke immediately. There was no need to fill every silence anymore. Finally, she smiled gently and said, "Thank you for refusing to let me become the kind of leader who only measured success in numbers." I smiled back, remembering the frightened woman who had accidentally sent one message months earlier. "You were always capable of becoming this leader," I answered quietly. "Someone just needed to remind you that people are the reason companies exist in the first place." She looked out across the city lights once more, and in that peaceful silence I realized that the strongest partnerships are built not on power, admiration, or even shared ambition, but on the simple courage to help another person become the best version of themselves. 5 years passed more quickly than I ever imagined possible. The city skyline outside Whitmore Global had changed with new buildings reaching higher into the clouds, but the greatest transformation had happened inside the company itself. The culture Claire had fought so hard to build had become stronger than any single leader. Employees greeted one another by name. Mentorship had become a tradition instead of a program. New managers were trained to listen before they spoke, and every orientation for new hires began with the same simple message: people always matter more than titles. Looking back, I often smiled at how impossible that future had once seemed. Claire had gradually stepped away from the role of chief executive officer, choosing to become executive chair and mentor the next generation of leaders instead of holding on to power simply because she could. When the board unanimously asked me to become the new chief executive officer, I spent an entire weekend trying to convince myself they had made a mistake. Claire only laughed when I told her that. "The best leaders are usually the ones who wonder whether they deserve the responsibility," she said. "That question keeps them humble." Standing backstage before the company's annual anniversary celebration, I adjusted the microphone clipped to my jacket and looked through the curtain at thousands of employees gathered inside the auditorium. Some had been with Whitmore Global for decades. Others had joined only weeks earlier. Every one of them was now part of a company built not only on innovation but on kindness. Claire stood nearby, no longer wearing the expression of a woman carrying the weight of an entire corporation alone. She looked peaceful, happier, free. "Are you nervous?" she asked with a familiar smile. I laughed softly. "Terrified." "Good," she replied. "It means you still care." My name was announced, and the audience welcomed me with warm applause as I walked onto the stage. I spoke about growth, resilience, teamwork, and the extraordinary people who had shaped the company's journey. I thanked the employees who had believed in difficult changes before the results became visible. I thanked the board for choosing courage over convenience. Finally, I invited Claire onto the stage. The standing ovation lasted nearly a full minute. She looked genuinely surprised by its length, placing one hand over her heart before embracing several longtime employees waiting near the front row. When the applause finally settled, I turned toward her with a smile that carried 5 years of memories. "There is something I have wanted to say in front of everyone," I began. Claire raised one eyebrow with playful curiosity. "Should I be worried?" The audience laughed gently. I shook my head. "Not this time." Taking a slow breath, I repeated the exact words that had accidentally changed both of our lives years earlier, this time with complete confidence and gratitude. "You have always looked at people in a way that reminds them they matter." Claire's eyes glistened as she smiled. "Would you say that again?" she asked quietly. I did. This time there was no embarrassment, no misunderstanding, and no fear waiting outside an apartment door. There was only truth spoken openly before the people whose lives had been changed, because one leader chose compassion over pride, and one assistant chose honesty over silence. As the audience rose once more in applause, I realized that the greatest success either of us would ever achieve had nothing to do with wealth, promotions, or recognition. It was the simple decision to see another human being beyond a title, because when people feel genuinely seen, respected, and valued, they often discover the courage to become the person they were always capable of being.